in the area of endophyte infected fescue, a lot of work on the reproductive side with it, and he's going to pull things together pretty much for us today, and putting the pieces together, an integrated approach to managing fall, fescue, and grazing systems. So, John, we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, John.
Yep.
Oh, am I on? Nope. I got lights on everywhere.
Yeah.
How about that? Yeah. The lights don't mean anything, apparently. So, yeah, Dabo and I are like this, but Dabo dances after a win. I won't be dancing today, I promise. So, I'll be reminding a lot today. A lot's been covered, and I had 45 minutes on the program, and I keep adding. Well, John, I think John's going to talk about that. So I add a few more slides and take one out, and add a few more slides and take one out. So we'll kind of see how long this goes, but I'll try to keep it moving. We're going to try to take an integrated approach, and you've seen this. I'm not going to linger long on this, but we focus today a lot, Glenn Aiken's talk, on the symptoms of tall fescue toxicosis. All of these symptoms. That's not an all-inclusive list either. A lot of these slides will be from that bulletin that Craig and I put together quite a few years ago now, and we focus on these grotesque images. You know, I always laugh. We do these dinner programs at cattlemen's meetings, and we show retained placentas and rotted off feet and cows without tail switches. So it's pretty rough stuff, but we make this out to be kind of a terrible, very obvious issue, you know, with these fescue foot and red bag and even restricted intestinal flow due to fat necrosis. But I want to take a little time and ask you, have we really lost sight of the obvious? And I pulled out a quote of my own. I guess academics kind of like obscure quotes, but here's one. Nothing fails like success. And you read that and you go, what the heck does that mean? That doesn't make any sense at all. But if we look back at all of these grotesque symptoms with fescue toxicosis, the serious ones, you know, where they're losing feet and we got 90% foal mortality. Have we, as extension educators, or I, or Chris, or Craig, focused too much on these grotesque things over the long term and made it counterproductive? We've shown producers these things over and over. You've sat in a cow and cattleman's meeting, I'm sure, and seen these symptoms. And you say, well, I don't have these. I don't have fescue toxicosis. Well, that's not true. Fescue toxicosis is often very subtle. And if you don't measure it, you can't manage it, right? So if you're not keeping close track of weaning weights, or you've got an extended calving season, if you don't measure it, you may not even know you've got fescue toxicosis. If you don't have a fence line down that with toxic and non-toxic, and you've got cattle in the shade and you've got cattle out grazing on a 60-degree day, you may not even realize it. So these things are pretty subtle. Again, impaired semen quality. How many of you measure that? But that doesn't mean it's not there. Again, it's a serious problem, but it's a subtle problem. 9 times out of 10, it's a subtle problem. And we've seen this number, $1 billion annually, every year cost to the beef industry. One of the thing that really drove this home, you can talk about how many bills that, you know, $1 bills that'll take to circle the equator and all that, but the thing that drove it home to me, so I was listening to Matt Poore at a talk, and, you know, fescue belt's pretty narrow, right? It's not a big area of the country. There's a lot of cows in that fescue belt, but it's not a big part of the country. Matt drove home this point with me, and I'll never forget it. He said, do you know what respiratory disease costs the beef industry every year? About $1 billion. And no one argues that respiratory issues are a huge problem in the beef cattle industry. And so this is big, folks. This is critical to the beef production systems in the Southeast, for sure. Probably our biggest issue. So how much subtle loss is normal, and I should probably put normal in quotes, in cow-calf operations? And again, I took this photo when I was at Georgia. This is at Shadydale, Georgia, just south of Athens, big beef operation. about a 1,000-acre operation, and this was a pretty cool spring morning, about 65 degrees, and those cattle were in the pond. Wasn't hot by any stretch of the imagination, but there's no doubt these cattle were suffering from fescue toxicosis. So again, these numbers, again, graphs, some of these taken straight from the bulletin that Craig mentioned earlier, but we see big dramatic drops in beef cow-calf reproduction. I'll talk about how to overcome these here in a little bit. But a good rule of thumb, for every 10% endophyte infection rate you have, that cow-calf, that conception rate drops about 5%, okay, 3.5% to 5%. So you got a 50% endophyte infection rate, that's about a 25% reduction in calving rates. And we see that over and over again, multiple studies. So if you don't have calves, you can't sell calves that are never born. Just as important, big impacts in weaning weights, 205-day weaning weights. This is old data. This is from a summary that we put together. You can compare these directly with endophyte-free and toxic endophyte. And on average, over multiple studies, we're looking at 72 pounds decrease in weaning weights with calves raised on toxic versus calves raised on endophyte-free in this case. So huge differences. Multiply that by, well, calves aren't over $2 a pound anymore, but last year that was a lot of money. This year it's still a lot of money, times $1.50 or whatever the market is this week. So we're talking some pretty serious money, well over $100 a head there by converting this. So we're going to focus, again, this first day is kind of wild. I don't know what other speakers are going to say, and we're going to repeat some things, but we're going to focus on this alkaloid management concept. As we go through the talk, and we're going to follow this flow chart. And mine's out of date. We gave this in New Zealand several years ago. I've still got the S in fertilization, so I feel sophisticated, like I should put my pinky up when I talk, Craig. But that's going to be the big presentation flow to this talk. We're going to talk about mitigation and things that have already been mentioned. This is sort of a review. It's kind of the wrap-up talk, so I'm not going to apologize for that, but we'll hit on these quickly. And we'll also talk about eliminating those toxins. And probably most important, we'll wrap up with some new stuff that we haven't seen yet today, and that's this strategic alkaloid management, where we partially renovate farms with non-toxic fescue. What happens if you take 25% of your acres and put them in Max Q or Bar Optima or one of these new varieties? How much impact can you make with 1/4 of your farm in that, which is easily done in 1 or 2 years in a renovation scheme? And some fall calving data, which is also really good. And then I've added some slides on some of the how to keep toxic fescue out, some myths and facts about that I've added. So again, we'll go through this flow chart, and we've hit on test what you got a lot. So I won't linger on that a lot, but occasionally infection rates are low, and not often, guys. We're in the southern end of the fescue belt, so most of our older fescue pastures are firecracker hot. Where I've seen infection rates low have been actually fairly newly planted stands of Kentucky 31 fescue. That Kentucky 31 fescue isn't necessarily very hot. It's like if you want a stand of crabgrass, what do you plant? Well, plant seeded Bermuda grass. You're guaranteed a stand of crabgrass, right? If you want it's very hard to. I've tried to plant some experimental hot plots of Kentucky 31, and we end up with 30-40% infection rates because the Kentucky 31 seed industry is kind of a brown bag industry. It's kind of sketchy. Yeah, it's not exactly reputable. It's more of a brown bag seed industry is what I'm getting at. So sometimes these newly established Kentucky 31 fields are more endophyte free than they are toxic Kentucky 31. That's not a bad thing in this case. All right, so let's talk about these 3 options and then about strategic management. And this option 1 is mitigating toxic tall fescue. And this is a slide I changed in the room last night. You ride 5.5 hours with Joe Boughton, and you get a sermon, brother, on toxic tall fescue. And this word stuck in my head in that 5-hour drive was mitigating. And I looked up the definition because I'm a little slow. When I got the room last night, I Googled this. It's the act of reducing the severity, seriousness, or painfulness of something. and reducing is a pretty good word there. We're not getting rid of anything here, folks. We're just making it less painful. That's not a bad thing. Again, it's a good option, and I'll show you when that's a good option. Rented land, other things like that. But I think it's very important to keep this in mind. It's not a permanent or a complete cure. These are annual costs in most cases to mitigate these toxicosis issues. So let's go through a few of them. These have been mentioned before. This is a good, I've used this photo 1,000 times probably, a photo I got from Carl Hovland at Georgia with Durana clover and a toxic stand of tall fescue. This is about a 45% stand of clover that looks like pure white clover. But clovers are an excellent option for diluting that toxic tall fescue. Again, an old study, 1980s with cow-calf. I'm not going to show much stocker data at all. We're going to show cow-calf data. But look what calf ADG does when you go from toxic to adding clover. About 0.6 of a pound increase. About a 75-pound increase in weaning weight. Remember Craig was talking about 112 versus 50, 60-pound increase. That's a big increase. And of course, 20% increase in conception rates. Great response to clover. Dilution is the solution to pollution, right? Again, again, kind of fits with the T-SNP data that Craig showed. Very toxic fescue, 98%. These are pregnancy rates, 55, 60% pregnancy rates in this study. This was done in Kentucky. You go to 50% infection, not a real hot stand, add 25% white clover, and we're still seeing issues. Still only about 70% increase in conception rates. And if you remove those toxins completely, get below 5% toxicity, we're up at 95 where we ought to be, right? So again, we're mitigating here. We're not eliminating. We're masking that problem, but it's a good thing. It's still a good thing. One thing I want to point out, and this is important, is that in this study, they broke out the 2- and 3-year-old cows. They did not respond to that dilution in this particular study. The younger cows that were under more stress, they're trying to get these first calf heifers rebred, they're growing, they're lactating, we're asking them to rebreed. Those did not respond to that clover dilution. They performed like it was toxic fescue, much more sensitive in the system. So again, something to think about is sensitivity of that herd and stress on that herd. Love the previous talk. That was fan. I love producer talks, and I apologize for the pretty scraggly looking lamb, but the best way to dilute is to avoid tall fescue completely, particularly in the summer. And this is one of Ray's crazy mix blends, some sorghum Sudan and pearl millet and cowpea. I think there's about 8 or 9 different things in here, but a great technique is just to get off that tall fescue altogether in the summer. And we won't linger long on that because it was covered so well in the previous talk. And there's lots and lots of options. And forages are local, right? I'm not going to tell you what to plant here, but there's a lot of options that you can either interseed to dilute or rotate to completely avoid. The pearl millet, sorghum Sudan, warm seasons, natives I don't have up there, which is a good option. We don't see those very often in South Carolina. And of course, you can rotate to non-toxic tall fescue as well. So again, lots of great options here, highly dependent on your environment, highly dependent on your fertility and management style. So there's been mention about seed head suppression and grazing height and other types of things as well. And of course, plant part does affect ergovaline concentration. We've known this for a very long time. This is early work from Missouri, George Rottinghouse's lab, and this is parts per billion ergovaline. And again, leaf blades, not very, remember, Joe mentioned 475 as being toxic. This is the lowest toxicity plant part, and we're at 400 here. And of course, stems a little higher, and seed heads are up over 1,200. So even our least toxic part is still pretty hot. But if we can keep these plants in a vegetative state by eliminating seed heads, either chemically or through mowing or grazing management, we can make some progress to that. And as far as eliminating toxicity, again, one slide on this. I just want to remind you. Great talk by Byron and a good option. Earlier work at, I believe, mafluidide, at Missouri, and I don't think that was ever labeled for pasture application, but it was effective. Metsulfuron now is labeled and does well and really improves animal performance. Very, very promising. I pulled these from the proceedings that Chris was kind enough to forward me in December. So great responses in weaning weight and variable responses, but pretty consistent really in improving conception rates. But again, it's an annual cost, and there are issues with potential stand longevity and you know, it's complicated. You can only apply at certain times. You got a fairly narrow window, and there's a limited amount of area that you can apply that to because of sequential applications. Still very high on this. It's a great management technique to use to alleviate this toxicity. Here's something that I think you'll find surprising, but not at the same time. And this takes that plant part talk one step further. The next slide is something that I think will really drive it home. And it's been mentioned by several, and that's nitrogen applications do increase ergovaline concentrations in tall fescue. And as we look, 0, 60, and 120 pounds per acre, increasing nitrogen application rates, and you can see all the plant parts increase with each rate, but we see a huge jump from 60 to 120 pounds per acre application. And particularly in these seed heads, you know, we're up at, you know, well over 1,000 parts per billion ergovaline in those seed heads. So we need to be judicious in our nitrogen application rates, and particularly in spring timing of those nitrogen applications. We've typically got way more forage than we need in the spring, so we need to focus probably more on fall application. And I know Chris has done some work on fall versus spring applications of nitrogen and forage production. But this makes a lot of sense to pay attention to these application rates. And really, at least in my part of the world, in that South Carolina, Georgia broiler layer area, poultry and turkey area, we got guys that'll put out 4 and 6 tons an acre of litter. Well, that's way over this 120. So they think, well, that litter's free. Well, it may be free, but it's costing you in some form or fashion. And this drives it home. That this is something I came across while putting together a talk for Southern Section Animal Science meetings a few years ago. And it's an older study, but this is why you have graduate students. They dig out stuff that you never heard of. And the graduate student I've got dug this out. It's I believe another Missouri study from the late 70s. This study was actually conducted before we knew about the endophyte, I believe. It was written up later. But this shows variable rates of nitrogen application in a system study, in a grazing system study. No nitrogen, 100 pounds per acre and 200 pounds an acre. You think, now, let me stop here a minute and say, I'm not telling you don't apply fertilizer, all right? Don't go home and tell your county agent, this forage specialist just told us we didn't need to fertilize. That's not what I'm telling you. Nitrogen's a valuable thing. Agronomists, I'm not going to go against 100 years of agronomy here, but look what happens as we increase this nitrogen application rate. Of course, we decrease the acres we need per cow-calf unit. That's why we do it, right? We increase that forage production. But remember that ergovaline slide. I showed you that last slide. And look at the conception rates, 80, 57, 28. These are spring calving cows. So something happened there. We hopped up that ergovaline in this particular study. This was a 3-year study, if I remember correctly. But we really increased the toxicity of that forage. This was hot fescue, I'm sure. We really hammered weaning weight. Went from 440-pound weaning weight to 400 pounds, so we decreased that 40 pounds. So these two compound on each other. We've got 50% fewer calves, and the calves we have are lighter. So we ended up with 68 pounds, 67 pounds of calf gain per acre versus 151. That nitrogen didn't help us out a lot in that case. Again, I'm not telling you not to fertilize, but I'm telling you fertilize judiciously, and there's oftentimes a cost to this. I dug a little deeper into the article because this really caught my attention, and that fertilization may not have only increased the ergovaline in that, but these systems ended up having, the low nitrogen had really variable. Some of them had real high rates of clover, some of them had none. But the high rates of the nitrogen fertilized fields had almost no clover in them. So it's probably a double whammy. We increased ergovaline, we decreased the clover in that stand, so we didn't allow them to select things other than tall fescue. So something to keep in mind. Yes, ma'am.
Why the A, B, and C?
Oh, that just shows that they're statistically different. I probably should take those out. It's a little confusing. That just shows they're really different.
If
So
you're going to take them out, you could reverse the no also.
you could reverse the what?
The no.
Or the zero in.
That's zero. Oh, he said it was
Oh,
no.
zero nitrogen. No nitrogen, zero nitrogen. Yeah, sorry.
Took me a while to figure
You know,
it out.
I've shown this slide probably 10 times and I've never thought of that.
Took me a few minutes to figure out what you were doing there.
It was brought up earlier about well, what about hay? What about the toxins in hay? And this is cured hay. Craig Roberts actually did this work. I'm showing his slides and I pulled it straight out of the paper, but you can't really see. That's about 600 parts per billion ergovaline, and at cutting, that stuff drops rapidly during the curing process and then levels off. So I believe this was a 60% reduction in ergovaline, something like that, Craig. And so ergovaline does drop significantly in cured hay. It's still toxic, but it's less toxic in the cured hay than particularly baleage or round bale silage that sort of pickles those toxins. So dry hay in this case can be a benefit. Doesn't solve the problem, it just mitigates it, makes it less severe. Again, I'm talking about a lot of other people's work in this audience. Matt Poor's sitting here and he's done a ton of great stockpiling work in alkaloids. Those alkaloids drop markedly in those cool winter months in that toxic tall fescue. And it also is a lot cooler time of the year whenever you graze that. So it's, again, this, like the nitrogen in clover were a double whammy, this is a double whammy to the good, where we've got lower temps and lower toxin loads. So Rob Collenbach has suggested maybe a double stockpiling method where you graze the stockpile Bermuda grass first, allow those toxins to drop in tall fescue and rotate to them. Or this takes a little bit of wrapping your hands around. Feed your hay first, or feed hay first while you still got grass, and you're stockpiling that tall fescue and allowing those toxins to drop and deferring that grazing to a cooler time of year. It's very hard to make yourself back up to a bale of hay and put it out when you've got fescue stockpiling, but maybe that's something we need to think about to defer that tall fescue to a less toxic time of year. Something to think about as you go through this. Again, I won't linger long on this. We talked about T-SNPs already, but tall fescue resistance or tolerance, I probably better change that slide before Craig smacks me. We've already gone across that. It doesn't ameliorate the effects, totally ameliorate them, but it's a great tool, particularly when we're looking at seed stock type stuff and looking at tolerance over the long term. Again, Craig and I probably should have talked before we presented this data, but we're looking at incremental alleviation with partial solutions in these toxic tall fescue systems. We're putting in annual input costs with these when we could remove those toxins with novel endophyte fescue and get the same or better response in almost all cases. So the question is, are we masking or mitigating tall fescue toxicosis, or are we eliminating it? So getting back to a good clover example, toxic tall fescue, half, 6/10 of a pound of gain, almost 1.5 pounds with endophyte free. This is some of Joe's data from Georgia with Durana clover. If we have toxic tall fescue with a little bit of clover, we do pretty good. We don't get quite to endophyte free fescue. We get over 50% clover, and I believe this is that pasture that I showed that steer in earlier with about 45% clover. We actually can get higher than that endophyte free tall fescue due to some dilution and nutrient quality aspects. But again, if we eliminate all those toxins, if we take all those toxins out and add the clover, we're at 2.5 pounds of gain. So we're just masking the problem in almost all cases here. We need to get those toxins out. And I realize we got a slide at the end that'll show why we can't get them out all the time, rented land and those types of things. But they're endemic. So, is this toxic seed a bargain? And I got this from Scott Flynn, Dow AgriSciences. Hot buy. That's the ad of the year. 50 pounds for $32.95. Is this seed a bargain? Would you ever? I'm hoping this is going in yards. Here's another great quote for you. This is a producer in South Carolina. Managing Kentucky 31 fescue is like teaching someone how to smoke cigarettes safely. Those toxins are always there, and Joe is one that has converted about 400 acres of owned and rented land to non-toxic fescues in a cow-calf operation in South Carolina. It's done a great job with this. So I'm going to argue that Kentucky 31 toxic fescue in pasture situations should never be purchased. That's my opinion. And I'll give you options as to why not to thicken with that right now. So we can remove that endophyte, and as we remove that endophyte, I've already showed you this data. We increase our conception rates up into the 90s. The problem is we decrease that persistence, the Superman Clark Kent aspect. This is a great way to get rid of the toxins. It's also an incredibly good way to get yourself in trouble as an extension specialist. But I don't think endophyte-free fescue is obsolete. I think there are some places that it can be used in some situations. One is hay production. It can be fairly persistent, particularly with good summer management and good cutting height in hay production. So it can perform well in those situations. Also, if it's in a short rotation to other crops, there's no sense paying $3.50 a pound for Max Q or Bar Optima seed when we're going to remove that. I think, again, this is why I don't think we should ever buy Kentucky 31. If we're going to plant tall fescue in thicken stands, pay another 15 or 20 or 25 cents a pound for endophyte-free seed and put something non-toxic into that thin stand of tall fescue to thicken it up. Maybe add some clover. 20 cents a pound increase in seed price. Even if you put a full rate of 20 pounds an acre out there, it's $4 an acre, guys. $4 an acre to put in a non-toxic forage versus Kentucky 31. May only last 3 years, but it's going, that $4 is going to be money well spent. We also can put in orchard grass versus Kentucky 31 to thicken those up. A bit on novel or friendly endophytes. Again, I won't linger long on these. A lot of good varieties, and there's more soon to be released. Some out of Kentucky that'll be released, and they do increase weaning weights and conception rates in quite a few studies. We're looking at about 50 pounds increased weaning weights. I'm with Craig. We've got producers routinely reporting 70 and 80 pound increased weaning weights in these situations on average. More for select calves, of course. All right, getting to the strategic use of fescue. The thing you hear over and over is, well, I can't convert my whole farm. There's no way I can convert my whole farm. And whether that's due to, again, rented land or something like this where the topography just won't allow it. This is actually a New Zealand photo with toxic perennial ryegrass. We can't convert all of these things to a non-toxic forage. We've got to hold that land in place. There are environmental issues there. So if one slide sticks with you, if 2 slides stick with you, I want these next 2 slides to really hang with you before you leave. This is a great study done at the University of Arkansas, and it's strategic use of novel endophyte fescue, and they used it with spring calving herds and fall calving herds, all right? And what they did, let me set this slide up. What they did here was they had 3 forage systems, and one is I want to make sure I don't turn this off. One is 100% toxic tall fescue stand. One is 100% novel endophyte stand. These are all spring calving cows in this slide. And in one of them, they took 25% of their farm, 25% of the acreage, and put it in Max Q, or I think it was Arc Plus in this case, in a non-toxic endophyte-infected fescue, and 75% stayed in non-toxic. So again, this can be converted in, if you destock a little bit, in 1 year's time, or 1.5 years' time. So again, just a limited acreage here. And look what happened. Toxic, and before I go on, they use this strategically. So 28 days prior to the calving prior to the breeding season starting, they grazed they turned in on this 25% of the pasture. To clean those cows out 28 days prior to turn in, and they grazed it as long as they could into the breeding season. They didn't get all the way through the breeding season, but they took it as long as they could. They also, at weaning, weaned those calves onto that non-toxic fescue. So they used it when they could get the most bang for their buck, when they could increase conception rates and hopefully increase weaning weights. So here's what happened, all right? They greatly increased calving rates. As a matter of fact, they were able to get it with 25% of the acreage to the same conception rate as a novel endophyte tall fescue, 100%. That's pretty good stuff there. That's pretty powerful. Also, slightly increased birth weights. They didn't compare these directly, but the birth weight or the weaning weights were improved a little bit. But just this strategic use during the breeding season will pay for that 25% of the acreage pretty quick. A great tool and something that won't take 10 years to get in place. This is something you can do in a couple years and do it relatively inexpensively with some planning. Here's the second thing I really want you to remember, and this is that fall calving versus spring calving. The producer talked before this said the fall calving cows rebred themselves. There's data to support that, and that's this slide right here. So this is fall 100% toxic tall fescue, and let's look at spring 100% toxic fescue. Let's just compare these two columns. 96% rebreed rate on the fall 100% non-toxic or 100% toxic fescue. You can't get much better than that. One of them might have slipped a pregnancy for all we know. So great impacts here on fall breeding. And as a matter of fact, equal or they weren't a direct comparison, but the spring 100% non-toxic fescue had an 80% conception rate. So great impacts there with fall breeding. Why does this happen, or fall calving? I'm gonna ask the audience that real quickly. Why does this happen? Why do these fall calving cows rebreed themselves?
Lower levels of the stuff in the fall.
The lower levels, yeah. The alkaloids decrease in the fall, right? Just like it's the stockpile tall fescue thing. We're breeding these cows in November, December. It's cool, and the toxin loads have dropped in that fescue. So it's a good time of year to get these cows bred, versus April, May, June when it's
Getting hot.
80, 85, 90 degrees, and we've got seed heads on that toxic fescue. So that's what that slide shows. I'm going to skip through that because of time. Okay, we solve one problem, but do we cause another? We've got low toxins at breeding in these fall calves, but what about the fetus? What's happening? Have we traded one evil for another? And this is I would rather have a calf born live than have an open cow. But here's something to think about as we move to these fall calving seasons. We've shifted those high alkaloid levels from the breeding season to that second and third trimester of gestation, when those calves are growing rapidly. So those of you that read Beef Magazine and those others know that fetal programming is a very hot topic, and we're trying to figure out how do these toxins impact fetal growth and development. And I know Matt Poor's working on this at NC State. We're doing a little bit of stuff in South Carolina. I'm sure I think Tennessee is also working on this as well. So there's quite a few things going on with this. And we've got a lamb study, a sheep study going on. We're using sheep as a model where we're feeding these sheep seed of toxic tall fescue in the last 2/3 of gestation by adding that seed at 800 parts per million of ergovaline. I'm still blown away by Matt's 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 parts per million. We're feeding 800, and I'm about to show you what happens to the fetus here. We fed this, and we saw a 40% reduction in lamb birth weights in this study. 40% reduction in carcass weight, and about a 25% reduction in viscera, in gut contents, gut weight. We took these lambs at birth and dressed them out, actually. And this is what these lambs look like. These lambs were born live. They were euthanized. But guess which one was the toxic fescue lamb? That bottom lamb. They had this runt pig look where they had probably, you know what a runt pig, you know how a runt pig happens. Restricted blood flow to it's the last piglet at the end of the line. The pipe's not big enough to feed that last piglet in that uterus. Well, there's only 2 lambs in this uterus, and that pipe wasn't big enough, and it feeds right back to that Aiken talk with vasoconstriction. So what impacts are we having in these fall calving herds when the toxins are very high in that time of year? And we don't know that. We don't know what's happening there, and we're going into this with some further studies, and I know NC State is, and I know Tennessee is as well. All right, so let's pull it all together. Let's think about all these pieces of the puzzle and try to piece them together. Consider a fall calving season, but this is major. There are major cash flow implications. There are forage shortage implications, particularly this time of year. You've got a pretty big calf on the side of that cow, and you've got 10 inches of snow on the ground. It can cause some stress, I'm sure. Consider, if you're mitigating, testing that herd and breeding that herd for tolerance. I used the right word there. Alkaloid management should be the focus. Alkaloid management and mitigation. Whether we're eliminating or mitigating, we need to think about alkaloids. I think Dr. Boughton is absolutely dead on, and alkaloids should become, that alkaloid level, or at least the presence of that alkaloid, should always be in the back of our minds. What are we impacting with those poisons, with those vasoconstrictors? And really the ultimate goal should be eliminating those toxins altogether. And if we can eliminate those altogether, removing them at strategic times with a renovation of an acreage, 25% of your acreage to non-toxic fescue, or maybe it's rotating those animals to sorghum Sudan or pearl millet or crabgrass in the summer months. All right, I said it was possible, but in a lot of cases, but here's a couple scenarios. We've got owned land or long-term lease options. Replacing that highly toxic fescue is economically viable. If you have any impact on conception rates at all, the payback on renovating this toxic tall fescue and replacing it with non-toxic, with calf prices today and an impact of 20% conception rate is probably, the payback's probably 3 to 5 years. I've got some older numbers on that that show it's about 6. As you renovate, prioritizing that land and developing a replacement plan. It's going to be highly producer specific, but target your productive land first and important areas, where you're going to breed, where your working facilities are, areas that are convenient. Renovating the back 40 that you can never get to, even though because you can never get to it is usually the most convenient to renovate because cows are never on it. That's probably not the most important area to get changed over, and utilize these strategically. Again, that 25% of acreage can make a massive difference in productivity like we saw earlier. And then in the meantime, implementing those other strategies on toxic pastures like clover, like seed head suppression. Fantastic options, but use those in the meantime as we're implementing these non-toxic forage. I suspect if you replace 25% of your acreage, that's going to be a gateway drug. I think that's when you realize, man, I got toxic fescue. I'm seeing huge impacts here. I need to get the other 75% out of here. So I think if you'll make that commitment, like it or not, that's going to be your gateway drug, and you're going to become obsessed with getting rid of the other toxic fescue. John, we've had talks in weed management seminars about how hard it is, in a lot of cases, to justify liming because you've got a year-to-year lease, and I understand those issues. That's a real problem, and it makes no sense in those cases to go in and spend $200. If you can't spend $40 an acre to lime, you can't spend $250 an acre to renovate. If you don't know you're going to have it next year. But that's what makes these cattle management options very attractive. Moving the calving season, genetic testing of that herd with the T-SNP technology. Seed head suppression becomes incredibly valuable in these situations where you can't afford to renovate. and even clover dilution. That dilution with clovers becomes probably less favorable because of the pH and fertility issues that we have with rented land. And of course, I can't give you a recipe. You're different than your neighbor, and you're certainly different than South Carolina. So these decisions are going to be very, very variable. So, all right, I've used my 45 minutes, and actually that's when my talk would have ended. But I've added a few slides here related to questions we got earlier. All right, so if you'll bear with me for about 3 slides, we'll work through these. All right, so some common concerns. I had taken these out and I added them back in. Will stands revert back to toxic tall fescue? And I've had endophyte-free stands. I think we can say yes. Endophyte-free stands will eventually revert back to toxic tall fescue. I've got novel here in all caps, and I think novel stands will remain non-toxic. I'm pretty certain novel stands will remain toxic if we manage those stands to maintain vigorous plants. We use rotational grazing. We keep a good residual height on that in a rotational grazing plan. And we keep those novel endophyte infected plants competitive. Also, we want to keep toxic seeds from being introduced to the field, and predominantly through hay, toxic hay feeding on those fields. And I'll show you. I've got a slide on that here in a bit. And by the way, I asked Joe, when I first got to Georgia 15 years ago, Joe had planted some plots with 5% toxic and 95% novel, and harvested those over several years. And that, something that makes me very confident in this is Joe said that 5% never really increased. That 5% didn't become 50% toxic in a few years. It was stable. It didn't outcompete the novel fescue. Is that accurate, Joe? So I don't think well-managed novel endophyte stands are going to revert back to toxic. Overgrazed stands, that's a different matter. How long do viable endophyte infected seeds stay in the seed bank? And some great Auburn work showed that tall fescue seed are viable for about 1.5 years. So if we can keep seed from being produced this spring and plant this fall, there should be a very limited number of viable toxic endophyte infected seeds in the stand. If we don't let it produce seed this spring, it's been 1.5 years when we plant this fall. So the field should be relatively clean. Does that make sense? That was a mouthful as well. Okay. Can we import it in animals? The short answer is yes. The practical answer is probably not, okay? And again, some great work by Steve Schmidt at Auburn, and some poor graduate student collected. They fed toxic fescue seed to cattle and collected a total fecal collection, and that's bad enough. Then they sifted all those seeds out and counted them and germinated them, and here's a calculation on infected plant seed in this feces, and you know, you feed a cow, let's see, a cow eats a bunch of seed, it's a pulse dose, and it's going to pass through that cow, remain in the rumen for a day or so, and end up through the system. And not all the seed that come out the back end are going to be alive. You know, some of those are going to be digested. So at the day they're pulled out of that toxic field, they're pooping out about 6,500 seed that day. One day after, it's down to about 4,000, and by day 2, they're down well below 1,000, and day 3, they're essentially non-existent. So if you can have a clean-out period, just like John said, for a couple days, most of those viable infected seed are gone. They've passed through. By the way, this is only a problem, you know, a few weeks of the year when you've got viable seed on that tall fescue. So if you're careful in the spring, or if you mow, or if you use seed head suppression, you don't have to worry about it. I agree. I think equipment is a bigger concern. And I think hay feeding is a bigger concern. Not because of what the cattle poop out, but because when you feed toxic fescue hay in a ring, there's disturbance. Not only disturbance, you've tilled those seed into the ground, and you fertilized it with urine and manure. So all of that is fescue seed germinating, by the way. So it's going to be a small area, but that's a window of opportunity to spread from there. So hay feeding areas, whether they're by ring or even rolled out, that mature hay is a vector for introducing toxic seed into those pastures. All right, last slide. Vivian Allen gave a talk years ago, probably 15, 20 years ago now, where she talked about grazing systems as a kaleidoscope, right? And if you shift one little thing, the whole kaleidoscope changes. And that's sort of the way these fescue mitigation things work. It's easy for us to talk about adding novel endophytes into a system, but once you do that, a lot of things end up changing in your system. So they're highly specific to individual farms and management within those farms. So I'd like to give you a recipe as to what you should do or what you must do, but really that's going to depend on you. I can give you a recipe as to how to renovate, with these spray, smother, spray, or mow and then 2 fall sprays and planting. But really the overall system is going to have to be developed by you. And more than likely, once you start implementing these things, let's say you implement that 25% acreage, more things are going to change after that. That system is going to continue to evolve over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So I hope that was a good summary and wrap up. I'd be happy to take, I went about 5 minutes over, but I'd be happy to take any questions you got related to this.
A couple questions for John.
Yes, sir.
What about, you try to cut your hay before it goes to seed, cut the bale, then come in and overseed a novel endophyte seed. Will that help?
If you cut your hay before seed production and then overseed novel into a live toxic stand, I don't really encourage that, because you're dealing with $3.50 seed into a highly toxic stand. I think the improvements will be minimal. I would encourage you to add clover in a situation like that, or maybe even crabgrass, something like warm season alternative. But as far as putting a non-toxic into a toxic field, no. Now you can prevent that toxic. You can mow that hay field if you prevent it from producing viable seed this spring. It usually takes 2 mows. You can go in this fall. I know Craig doesn't like this in Missouri, but we've done quite a bit of work with it in South Carolina and Georgia. You can spray that with about 1.5 quarts of Roundup in early August. Wait 6 weeks. Spray it with another 1.5 quarts in mid-late September, and no-till drill novel fescue into that kill stand. And we've gone back and measured those, and we've got infection rates from toxic tall fescue from 0 to 4% escapes. And we've done that on farm, and we've done that in small plots on research stations. That's a very effective way, but you can't let that fescue produce seeds this spring. So, but that eliminates the summer smother crop.
Any other questions for John?
Cost comparison is novel seed to 31 fescue.
Cost comparison of novel seed to endophyte free seed? Right. Novel seed's running $3.50, $3.75 a pound. Endophyte free seed, I believe, is around 70, 80, 90 cents. Is that right? Or is up to $1.25? Probably variety dependent and supply dependent, but a third or less for the endophyte free. You're giving up persistence for that. It's not a forever crop by any means. We've had some people very successful in hay production. Cow lips are a pretty powerful tool when it comes to persistence. You can keep endophyte free stands for 3+ years by staying off of them in the summer and maintaining that residual height, but it's not going to be a forever thing. So, the one thing about these renovation plans is you're dealing with 20 pounds of seed per acre is what we recommend, and $1, to make the math easy, $1.25 versus $3.75. That's $2.50 a pound times 20. That's $45 difference in seed cost, but you've got probably $150 an acre difference, $150 already invested no matter what you do in herbicides or tillage or planting and fertilizer. So everybody gets focused on that seed cost, but as a whole, that's a pretty minor cost. So what did I say it was, $40 an acre? That's 3 to 4 herbicide applications over the life of that stand. That's really nothing. Or that would be 80 pounds. That's 1 fertilizer application. So that seed cost is a minor. I'm not the one writing the check, but that seed cost is a pretty minor thing when it comes to overall cost. So, yes, sir.